My phone rang just after sunset, the kind of hour when the house feels quieter than it should. I remember thinking it was strange because my son never called without warning anymore. When I answered, his voice came through light and rushed as if he were late for something better. "Dad," he said, not waiting for me to respond. "I'm getting married tomorrow." There was a pause, barely a breath, and then he kept going. "I've drained every dollar from your bank accounts. I also sold the house. Everything's handled. Bye." The line went dead. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. No explanation, no hesitation. Just a clean, careless exit, like he'd closed a door he never planned to open again. And then, to my own surprise, I laughed. It wasn't loud at first. Just a short breath that escaped before I could stop it. Then another. My shoulders started to shake, and I had to sit down at the kitchen table to keep myself steady. If someone had walked in at that moment, they would have thought I'd finally lost my mind. A 70-year-old man freshly robbed by his own son, laughing alone in an empty house. I didn't understand the laughter right away. All I knew was this: my son believed he had just erased me. He believed that phone call was the end of my story. He had no idea what he'd actually done. When the call ended, the house went back to being exactly what it had been 5 minutes earlier. The clock over the stove ticked on. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the road and disappeared down the hill. Nothing about the world seemed to acknowledge what had just happened. I lowered the phone onto the table and stared at it as if it might ring again and correct itself. It didn't. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything else. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't dizzy. My heart wasn't racing. I felt clear. At 70, people expect confusion. They expect panic. They expect a man like me to crumble when the ground shifts beneath his feet. But my mind was sharp, and every word my son had spoken replayed itself with uncomfortable precision. Tomorrow. Married. Drained. Sold. Bye. I pushed my chair back and walked through the house, slow and deliberate. The hallway light cast the same familiar shadow along the wall. The framed photos were still where they'd always been. A younger version of me, my wife, smiling beside me. My son at 10, missing a front tooth, proud and careless in a way children are allowed to be. I stopped in front of that photo longer than the others. For years, my life had followed a quiet, predictable rhythm. I woke early. I made my coffee the same way every morning. I kept my routine small on purpose. After everything I'd built, everything I'd stepped away from, I'd chosen a life that didn't draw attention. People who didn't know me well mistook that for decline. They thought I'd faded. I let them think that. The truth was, this calm had been earned. I lived modestly, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Control to me had never been about display. It was about stability, about knowing exactly where you stood when the noise stopped. I sat back down at the table and folded my hands in front of me. That was when disbelief finally settled in, heavy and cold. Not disbelief that the money was gone, not disbelief that the house had been sold. Disbelief that my own son had said it so easily. There had been a time when he would have called me for advice, for reassurance, even for permission. Somewhere along the way, those calls had stopped. I told myself it was independence, that it was healthy, that he was building his own life. What I hadn't admitted was how far away he'd already drifted. I raised him to be capable, to think ahead, to never rely on shortcuts. His mother and I had agreed on that much, even when we disagreed on everything else. After she passed, it was just the two of us, and I made sure he never felt the weight of that loss the way I had. I worked longer hours. I planned further ahead. I absorbed every uncertainty so he wouldn't have to. That was the irony sitting in my chest now. Everything I had built for him had taught him exactly how to take it. The laughter came back to me then, not as sound, but as understanding. I realized why it had surfaced in that moment, sharp and involuntary. My son hadn't called to negotiate. He hadn't called to argue. He had called to declare victory. Victory only makes sense when both sides are playing the same game. I walked to the window and looked out at the darkened yard. The trees stood unmoving, their outlines clear against the fading sky. I'd stood in that same spot countless nights before, thinking about nothing in particular, content in the quiet. Tonight the quiet felt different. Not empty. Focused. I didn't reach for the phone to call him back. I didn't rush to check my accounts. I didn't collapse into anger or grief. Those reactions would come later, maybe, but not yet. Right now, my mind was lining things up the way it always did when something important shifted. My son believed the story was simple. He believed money was power. He believed ownership was obvious. He believed I was finished. He believed wrong. As I turned away from the window, I felt something settle into place inside me. A familiar sensation I hadn't felt in years, the quiet certainty that comes when you recognize a turning point and don't flinch from it. Tomorrow he would stand at an altar, convinced he'd secured his future. Tonight I sat alone in my kitchen, listening to the clock tick and realizing something he never would. This wasn't the end of my life. It was the moment it demanded an answer. To understand the betrayal, you have to understand what came before it. Not the last few years, not the slow drift or the unanswered calls, but the foundation, the choices, the promises made quietly without witnesses when no one was watching and no one was keeping score. I became a father later than most. By the time my son was born, I had already learned what instability could do to a man. I had watched careers vanish overnight, watched pride turn into desperation, watched good people make terrible choices because they felt cornered. When I held him for the first time, small and warm against my chest, I made a decision that shaped everything that followed. He would never feel cornered if I could help it. He would never have to make choices out of fear. That decision didn't come with speeches or dramatic gestures. It showed itself in long hours and careful planning, in turning down things I wanted so he could have things he needed, in thinking 10 years ahead instead of 10 minutes. I didn't raise him with extravagance. I raised him with consistency, a roof that stayed put, food that appeared on the table without question, problems that were handled before they reached him. People talk about sacrifice as if it's loud, as if it announces itself. In my experience, real sacrifice is quiet. It looks like routine. It looks like saying no when no one would blame you for saying yes. As he grew older, I taught him the rules I believed in. Work first, reward later. Plan before you act. Never assume something belongs to you just because it's nearby. I didn't spoil him. I didn't deprive him either. I wanted him to understand effort, not entitlement. For a long time, I thought he did. I built my life steadily, brick by brick, the way my father had taught me. I didn't chase shortcuts or gamble on quick returns. I saved. I diversified. I learned to read people as carefully as I read numbers. Success came, but it came quietly the way I preferred it. To me, money was never about winning. It was about insulation, about having enough space between you and disaster that you could breathe. I never spoke about those things at the dinner table. I never turned lessons into lectures. Children learn more from what you do than what you say. And I assumed he was watching. What I didn't notice at first were the small shifts. The impatience when things didn't move quickly enough. The irritation when I asked questions instead of writing checks. The way his eyes lingered on outcomes rather than processes. None of it was alarming on its own. If anything, it looked like ambition. I told myself that was normal. Healthy, even. There was a moment years ago that I think about now more often than I'd like. It was nothing dramatic. Just a conversation that ended a little too abruptly. He had asked me about a decision I'd made, something involving timing and restraint. When I explained my reasoning, he listened, nodded, and then said, "You worry too much. Sometimes you just have to take what's there." I remember smiling, then brushing it off. Different generations, I thought. different appetites for risk. I didn't push back. I didn't correct him. I chose patience, believing time would do the work for me. That was my mistake. I believed guidance was enough. That example would speak louder than boundaries. That if I trusted him, he would rise to meet that trust. I didn't consider how generosity could be mistaken for permission, how silence could be read as approval. When his mother passed, I pulled even more inward, not away from him, but into the structure of my life. Grief has a way of clarifying priorities. I simplified. I reduced noise. I stepped back from roles that demanded attention and visibility. People assumed I was slowing down, that I was winding things down. In truth, I was consolidating. There had been a period when my name carried weight in rooms most people never entered. Negotiations that didn't leave paper trails, decisions that affected more than just me. I stepped away from that world deliberately, not because I couldn't keep up, but because I no longer needed to. I had done what I set out to do. I had built something stable enough to stand without constant supervision. I never told my son about that part of my life in detail. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't think it mattered. He knew me as his father, not as a resume. I believed that was enough. Looking back, I see how that silence created space for misunderstanding. He saw the modest routines, the quiet house, the absence of display, and he filled in the blanks with his own conclusions. By the time he was an adult, the distance between us had stopped feeling temporary. Our conversations became shorter, more transactional. Updates instead of discussions. When he spoke about his plans, they were framed as inevitabilities, not possibilities. He didn't ask what I thought. He informed me of what he'd decided. I noticed. I just didn't act. There's a line between trusting your child and relinquishing authority altogether. I crossed it without realizing. I told myself I was respecting his independence, when in reality, I was avoiding conflict. Conflict felt like failure, like admitting that something in my careful planning had gone wrong. I had built a life meant to protect him from fear. I hadn't built one meant to protect me from him. By the time he made that phone call, the groundwork had already been laid. The assumptions, the entitlement, the belief that what I had was meant to be taken, not earned. He didn't see theft. He saw inheritance accelerated. He didn't hear betrayal. He heard efficiency. That understanding didn't make the call hurt less, but it did strip it of its mystery. Betrayal feels different when you recognize its roots. It stops feeling like chaos and starts feeling like consequence. As I sat alone that night, the house still quiet around me, I realized something else as well. The distance between us wasn't created in a single moment. It had grown slowly, fed by my restraint and his impatience, my silence and his certainty. Tomorrow he would celebrate what he thought was a victory. Tonight I was finally willing to admit what I had been avoiding for years. The life I built so he would never have to struggle had taught him exactly how to believe he was entitled to everything I owned. And that realization, more than the loss of money or property, told me what had to come next. Betrayal doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. Most of the time it slips in wearing concern, speaking softly, asking reasonable questions. That's how it began with my son. Not with theft, not with threats, but with discomfort I chose to ignore. The first call came on an ordinary afternoon. I remember because I was trimming the hedges out front, sweat on my collar, hands, dirty mind clear. When I saw his name on the screen, I felt a flicker of relief. It had been a while since he'd called just to talk. "Dad," he said, his voice careful in a way I wasn't used to. "I've been thinking about you." That alone should have made me pause. He talked about being busy, about how fast life was moving, about how he worried I was carrying too much on my own. He asked questions that sounded thoughtful. Was I keeping track of everything easily? Did I ever feel overwhelmed? Did I have someone I trusted to help with details if I needed it? I told him I was fine. I always told him that. He laughed lightly, said he knew I'd say that, and then suggested we go over a few things together sometime, just to be safe, just to make sure everything was organized. The word he kept using was help. At the time, I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, recognition. It was the same feeling you get when a room goes quiet for no obvious reason. I dismissed it as pride. No father enjoys being asked if he can still manage his own life. So I agreed. The requests came slowly after that. Nothing dramatic. A question about where certain statements were kept. A suggestion that it might be easier if he understood how things were structured in case of emergencies. He framed everything as preparation. Planning, responsibility. Each request on its own made sense. That's how manipulation works best. It hides inside reason. I noticed myself hesitating before answering, measuring my words. That was new. I had never felt the need to guard information from my own son. The hesitation bothered me more than the questions did. It felt like a crack in something I'd always believed was solid. Around that time, he introduced me to the woman he was seeing more seriously. She joined us for dinner one evening, polite and attentive, her smile practiced but not insincere. She didn't speak much, but she listened closely. Too closely. While my son talked, she watched. Not just him. Me. The house. The way I moved through it. Her eyes lingered on things people usually overlook. The shelves, the walls, the quiet. She asked careful questions, never directly about money, never outright. Instead, she asked about stability, about plans, about how long I intended to stay where I was. Questions that sounded like curiosity, but carried weight if you knew how to hear them. At one point she asked, "Have you ever thought about simplifying things? You know, making life easier." I told her my life was already simple. She smiled and said nothing more, but something about the way she exchanged a look with my son stayed with me long after they left. There was another conversation, not long after that one, that settled deeper than the rest. My son brought up the idea of timing, how it made sense to act while opportunities were clear instead of waiting for uncertainty. He spoke confidently as if he'd already decided how things should unfold. I asked him what he meant. He waved it off, said it was just something he'd been thinking about, that it didn't matter. But the ease with which he dismissed my question told me everything. He wasn't thinking out loud. He was testing boundaries. That night, after the house was quiet again, I found myself opening my laptop and checking accounts I rarely worried about. Not because I expected to find anything wrong, but because I needed to reassure myself that trust was still intact. Everything was where it should have been. Still, I checked twice. I told myself I was being paranoid. That age makes you cautious, that I was projecting my own habits onto him unfairly. Parents are good at making excuses for their children. We confuse loyalty with denial more often than we admit. I chose generosity. I chose to believe that concern was concern, not strategy. I chose silence over confrontation because confrontation felt like accusing him of something I couldn't yet name. Looking back, I see how those choices shaped what followed. Silence creates space, and in that space, intention grows unchecked. Over the next few weeks, his tone changed subtly. Less warmth, more certainty. He spoke less like a son asking for input and more like someone confirming assumptions. He would say things like, "When we handle this," or "once it's settled," as if decisions had already been made somewhere beyond my reach. I began listening differently then. Not just to what he said, but to what he avoided. The pauses. The words he never used. He never asked what I wanted. Not once. There was a moment late one evening when I sat alone at the kitchen table and admitted something I had been resisting. The discomfort wasn't about money or control. It was about respect. Or rather, the absence of it. I realized I was being managed. That realization didn't bring anger. It brought clarity. the kind that sharpens your senses and quiets your emotions. I stopped offering information freely. I answered questions with questions. I observed instead of explaining. He didn't notice right away. People rarely do when they believe they're already ahead. The woman noticed. Her questions became more direct, though still wrapped in politeness. Her concern felt less like care and more like urgency. She wanted things resolved, streamlined, final. I gave her nothing. By then I understood something important. This wasn't about helping me. It was about positioning themselves. About control disguised as responsibility. About deciding my future without inviting me into the conversation. That was the last moment when a simple conversation could have changed everything. I see that now. A direct question, a firm boundary, a refusal to play along. I didn't take it. Instead, I watched. I listened. I learned. When you stop assuming good intentions, patterns become visible. When you stop filling in gaps with trust, you start seeing designs where you once saw coincidence. By the time I noticed the first real imbalance in my accounts, the shift had already happened. Trust had given way to alertness, assumption to awareness. I was no longer waiting for reassurance. I was preparing for proof. Once suspicion takes hold, feelings stop mattering. Numbers don't lie, and they don't care who you love. That morning, I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee that went cold, untouched, doing what I had done 1,000 times before. Checking accounts, verifying balances, a routine so familiar it barely registered as an action. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The screen loaded slowly, as it sometimes did, and I waited without impatience. I had always trusted systems more than people when precision mattered. Systems left trails, people left excuses. When the numbers appeared, I leaned in slightly. Not because I was alarmed, but because something didn't align with what I expected to see. The balance was lower. Not dramatically. Not enough to trigger alarms, or calls, or notifications. Just enough to feel off. I refreshed the page. The balance changed again. That was when the coffee finally lost all meaning. I set the mug aside and straightened in my chair. My hands were steady on the desk, my breathing slow. Panic didn't arrive, and that absence was almost unsettling. I clicked through transaction histories, scanning dates, amounts, destinations. Each movement of the cursor felt deliberate, controlled. There were transfers I didn't recognize, not mistakes, not fees. Transfers, clean, intentional movements of money from one place to another. Authorized, logged, approved. I checked another account, then another. The pattern repeated itself with quiet consistency. Not chaos, not a sudden drain. This wasn't someone smashing windows and running off with whatever they could carry. This was careful, measured, planned. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment, not to avoid what I was seeing, but to absorb it. This was the difference between a problem and a breach. Problems can be fixed. Breaches change how you see the world. I opened my eyes and went back to the screen. The amounts were significant now, undeniable. Entire sections of my financial life had been hollowed out, leaving clean edges where substance used to be. The absence was louder than any error message could have been. Still, I didn't rush to conclusions. I picked up the phone and made a call, my voice even professional, stripped of anything that might hint at personal stakes. I asked questions. I verified dates. I requested confirmation. The person on the other end spoke carefully, reading from records, explaining processes. When they mentioned authorization, I asked for specifics, credentials, access points, names attached to approvals. My son's name surfaced without drama. There was no accusation in the confirmation, no judgment. Just a fact. Access had been granted through channels that appeared legitimate. Permissions that should never have been exercised that way, but were. I thanked them and ended the call. That was the moment intent became undeniable. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't concern. It wasn't help gone wrong. This was execution. I sat there longer than I needed to, staring at the screen as if something might change if I gave it time. It didn't. The numbers stayed where they were. Empty. Final. I expected anger then. Or grief. Or the kind of panic that steals your breath. None of it came. What arrived instead was a heavy, clarifying calm. The kind you feel when uncertainty finally resolves itself into truth. I thought back to his tone on the phone. The confidence, the finality. The way he'd spoken as if the outcome had already been decided. He hadn't been bluffing. He'd been reporting. I closed the laptop and rested my hands on the desk. My body felt still grounded, as if instinctively it understood that reaction would only give away information. Emotion was noise. Noise could be exploited. I walked through the house again, slower this time, noticing details I had ignored for years. The worn edge of the counter. The faint scratch on the doorframe from when my son had moved furniture too quickly as a teenager. The familiarity of it all, pressed against the unfamiliar reality forming beneath my feet. There was a moment, brief but sharp, when memory rearranged itself. Something he had said weeks earlier, something casual at the time, now revealed its true shape. A comment about timing, about efficiency, about not letting opportunities slip. At the time, I'd heard ambition. Now I heard rehearsal. I returned to my desk and made a list. Not on paper, in my head. What had been accessed? What authority had been assumed? What documentation would exist? Where trails would lead? This wasn't about recovering money yet. It was about understanding the full scope of what he believed he'd taken. I did not call him. That decision was as important as any I made that day. Confrontation would only confirm success, alert him to what I knew, give him time to adjust. Silence in this moment was leverage. He believed I was stunned, cornered. That belief was useful. Instead, I gathered information. Quietly, methodically. I reviewed records I hadn't needed in years. I cross-referenced dates with conversations. I traced access points back to their origins. What struck me most wasn't the audacity of it, but the assumption behind it. He hadn't acted cautiously. He hadn't hedged his bets. He'd moved as if ownership were a given, as if proximity equaled entitlement. That assumption told me more than the missing money ever could. I thought about how often age is mistaken for decline, how quickly people write off those who no longer announce themselves, how invisibility becomes a form of camouflage if you know how to use it. By late afternoon, I had confirmed everything I needed to confirm for that stage. Not the full picture, but enough to know this wasn't an accident and it wasn't isolated. There were layers here. Layers he hadn't considered because considering them would have required asking questions he never bothered to ask. I stood up and looked out the window again. The light had shifted, casting long shadows across the yard. Somewhere my son was planning a wedding, celebrating what he believed was a decisive move. He thought he had taken my future in a single stroke. What he had actually done was expose himself. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet house, I drew a line inside myself. Money could be replaced. Structures could be repaired. But intent once revealed could never be ignored again. This was no longer about loss. It was about response. And I was done pretending not to see what was right in front of me. Money was never the sharpest weapon he used. Control was. The money simply made it visible. The message came the next morning, brief and confident, as if the matter were already closed. He didn't ask where I was staying or how I was feeling. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He spoke as though he were updating me on a schedule he'd finalized without my input. "The house is sold," he said. "You'll need to make other arrangements." The word house landed heavier than the rest, not because I didn't expect it, but because of what it represented to him. To my son, the house wasn't a place. It was leverage. Proof. a symbol that the ground beneath my feet had been removed. I let him keep talking. He explained timelines and logistics with the confidence of someone reading from a checklist. He spoke quickly, efficiently, already moving past the consequences. There was a faint edge of satisfaction in his voice, not cruel exactly, but assured. He believed he was being practical. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I didn't ask questions. When he finished, he waited for my response. "All right," I said. That was it. The silence on the other end of the line stretched just long enough for him to feel it. He had expected resistance, or panic, or at least confusion. My calm unsettled him, though he wouldn't have admitted it. He cleared his throat and ended the call. I sat there for a moment after the line went dead, letting the weight of that single word settle. All right. It had meant exactly what it sounded like. I had heard him. I had understood him. And I had chosen not to reveal a thing. The house had always meant more to him than it ever did to me. To him, it was visible proof of stability, something you could point to and say, "This is mine now." He never understood that visibility and control are not the same thing. I walked through the rooms, slowly touching nothing, observing everything. The house was familiar, comfortable, predictable. It had served its purpose well. It had sheltered a family, absorbed arguments and laughter, watched years pass quietly. But it had never been the core of my life. It was an asset, useful, replaceable. That distinction mattered now. I sat down at my desk and began verifying what he believed he had taken. Not out of anxiety, but out of curiosity. Assumptions are revealing when you take the time to examine them. I checked records related to the property, ownership details, agreements, conditions. I wasn't searching for a surprise. I already knew where things stood. This was confirmation, not discovery. There it was, exactly as I expected. Clean, precise, unchanged. I allowed myself a slow breath. Not relief, recognition. My son had acted on partial knowledge. He had seen what was visible and assumed it was complete. He had never asked why certain things were structured the way they were. He had never wondered why I was so unbothered by appearances. He had mistaken silence for absence. That mistake was his. There was a name he never noticed, a detail he never questioned, a layer he assumed didn't exist because it wasn't displayed for him. He didn't look closely enough to see it, and even if he had, he wouldn't have understood what he was seeing. That was the moment everything shifted inside me. Not triumph, not satisfaction, understanding. He hadn't taken my security. He had exposed his own thinking. I thought back to the way he spoke about efficiency, about not letting opportunities slip. He had rushed. He had moved before confirming the ground beneath him. In his mind, speed equaled intelligence. He didn't know that restraint often carries more power than urgency. I didn't act on that knowledge right away. Acting would have been premature. Instead, I let him believe the story he'd written. Belief shapes behavior, and behavior creates patterns. Patterns are predictable. Silence, when used deliberately, becomes a mirror. People project their assumptions into it. My son filled that silence with confidence. Over the next few days, his tone changed again. Less cautious, more directive. He spoke as if he were already managing my life. He referenced future decisions, casually assuming my compliance. He spoke about me, not to me. His wife began reaching out as well. Her messages were polite, efficient, wrapped in concern that felt rehearsed. She offered suggestions, solutions, simplifications. Each one carried an unspoken premise that I was no longer the authority in my own life. I responded slowly, minimally, never committing, never resisting outright. Every reply was measured, every pause intentional. What they didn't realize was that every assumption they voiced gave me more information. They revealed timelines they hadn't meant to share, priorities they hadn't thought to hide. The scope of what they believed was already settled. They thought the house was the final piece, the last obstacle removed. Without it, they believed I had nowhere to stand. They didn't understand that the house was never the prize. The real leverage in my life had never been tied to walls or addresses. It lived in preparation, in foresight, in decisions made years earlier quietly without fanfare. Decisions that didn't announce themselves until they were needed. I spent that week expanding the board in my mind, mapping who else might be affected by my son's actions, who might already be involved without realizing it. Every transaction creates ripples. He had moved quickly, but speed leaves traces. This was no longer just a conflict between a father and a son. Other parties were already closer to the edge than they realized. Timelines were intersecting. Consequences were aligning. One evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the house still and, dim around me, and allowed myself a single moment of honesty. I wasn't angry about losing the house. I wasn't even angry about the money. I was angry about the assumption that I would fold, that age had softened me, that my quiet meant surrender, that my life had narrowed to what he could see. That assumption was going to cost him more than he understood. I didn't rush. I didn't make calls yet. Preparation is wasted if it's rushed. I gathered what I needed quietly, piece by piece, confirming what I already knew and noting what would matter later. Outside, the days moved on. My son settled into his new life confident and distracted. He enjoyed the comfort of believing he was untouchable. That belief would guide his next moves, and those moves would matter. As I turned out the lights that night, I looked around the house one last time without sentiment. It had been useful. It had done its job. Soon it would be someone else's concern. What my son didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that by taking what he thought was everything, he had finally pushed me into a position I hadn't occupied in years. A position of clarity. And clarity, once reclaimed, is difficult to stop. There comes a moment when love stops being protection and becomes permission. I recognized that moment quietly, without drama, sitting alone at my desk as morning light crept across the floor. Until then, I'd still been thinking like a father, weighing consequences through the lens of what might hurt him less, what might preserve some fragment of the relationship we used to have. That morning I stopped. It wasn't anger that did it. It wasn't pride or wounded ego. It was clarity. Clear, clean, and unmistakable. My son had not made a mistake. He had made a choice. And choices require responses, not forgiveness disguised as patience. I drew a line I should have drawn years earlier. Love does not require self-destruction. Parenthood does not mean surrendering your agency. Whatever bond we shared did not grant him the right to decide my future without my consent. That realization hurt more than anything else so far. Not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I had been avoiding. He no longer saw me as his father. He saw me as a resource. Something to be managed, harvested, and moved aside once its usefulness expired. I allowed myself a few minutes with that truth. Not to wallow in it, but to acknowledge it fully. Grief that is ignored tends to rot. Grief that is faced becomes manageable. Then I picked up the phone. The first call I made was not to family, not to friends, not to anyone who would respond emotionally. I reached out to someone who understood systems, consequences, and discretion. Someone who knew how to listen without interrupting and act without announcing it. We spoke briefly. I gave only what was necessary. Dates, actions, confirmations. I didn't ask for reassurance. I asked for process. When the call ended, nothing had been resolved yet, but something important had begun moving. It felt familiar. There was a time in my life when this kind of preparation had been routine. When my days were shaped by anticipation rather than reaction. I had stepped away from that world years ago, content to let it belong to my past. But skill doesn't disappear just because you stop using it. It waits, patient, ready. As I moved through the house that day, I noticed how age had worked in my favor without my realizing it. People expect slowness. They expect confusion. They expect an older man to cling to routine and avoid complexity. That expectation creates space. Space to think. Space to move without drawing attention. My son had underestimated me not because he was cruel, but because he was careless. He assumed time had eroded my edge. He mistook quiet for weakness. That assumption was now an asset. Over the next few days, I began assembling what I needed quietly and methodically. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't rush. I reached out only to those who understood the value of restraint. Conversations were brief, focused, purposeful. Each step was small on its own. Together they formed something solid. There was no satisfaction in this process. No thrill. Revenge fantasies belong to people who confuse chaos with power. What I felt instead was steadiness, the kind that comes when you stop hoping for different outcomes and start preparing for the ones that are inevitable. At night, when the house settled into silence, I allowed myself moments of reflection, not about money or property, but about the child I once knew. The boy who had asked questions without agendas, who had trusted me without calculation. I mourned that version of him quietly without ceremony. By morning, I was done mourning. From that point forward, silence became strategy. Every unanswered message, every delayed response, every neutral reply served a purpose. My son filled the gaps with his own confidence. His wife filled them with plans. They spoke as though the future were already mapped, already secured. I let them. One evening, as I sat reviewing notes I'd kept mentally rather than on paper, I recognized the point of no return. Once you involve systems larger than yourself, there is no undoing the process. No calling it off because emotions soften. No reversing momentum because doubt creeps in. I was past that point. That realization didn't scare me. It grounded me. Fear thrives in ambiguity. I had none left. There was a brief moment late one night when I considered calling my son, telling him to stop, to slow down, to talk to me, not as a warning, but as a final attempt to reach whatever remained of our bond. I didn't make the call. Warnings help only those willing to listen. He wasn't listening anymore. He was performing certainty, and certainty makes people reckless. Instead, I focused on timing. Timing matters more than force. Acting too soon reveals intent. Acting too late concedes ground. The space between is where leverage lives. I watched his behavior change as his confidence grew. He spoke less carefully. He assumed more. He began planning openly, convinced that no resistance was coming. His wife followed suit, moving from suggestion to instruction, from concern to control. They thought they were closing doors. They didn't realize they were walking deeper into a structure they couldn't see. There was grief in that realization, but also relief. The kind that comes when you stop lying to yourself. When you accept that preserving dignity sometimes means letting relationships end in truth rather than continue in illusion. By the end of that week, everything I needed was in motion. Not finished, not revealed, but aligned. I didn't feel powerful. I felt prepared. Preparation is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand acknowledgement. It simply waits for the moment when action becomes necessary. As I turned off the light and settled into bed that night, I understood something that had taken me decades to learn. The most dangerous decisions are not the ones made in anger or fear. They are the ones made slowly, deliberately, with full awareness of what they will cost. I had stopped being his father in the way he wanted. What remained was something far more dangerous to underestimate. A man who knew exactly where he stood and exactly what he was willing to lose. I decided to attend the wedding the night before it happened, long after the invitations had been sent and the seating finalized. My son didn't ask if I would be there. He assumed I would. Absence to him would have looked like resistance. Presence would look like acceptance. I chose presence. The venue sat on a manicured hill outside the city, all glass and polished stone designed to impress from a distance. As I stepped out of the car, I could hear music drifting across the lawn, bright and confident. Everything about the place announced success. Money had been spent with enthusiasm. It was the kind of celebration meant to signal arrival. People noticed me immediately, though, not in the way they once might have. They saw an older man in a dark suit moving carefully, smiling politely. A father, a formality. Something symbolic rather than significant. That was fine. Inside, the air was cool and perfumed. Laughter echoed off the walls. Champagne glasses caught the light as they were raised and lowered. I accepted a drink and held it without sipping, letting the room reveal itself to me. Weddings are performances. They show you who believes they are important, who believes they are secure, and who is watching closely enough to know the difference. My son spotted me near the entrance. Relief crossed his face before he could stop it. He walked over quickly, arms open, playing the part expected of him. His embrace was brief and careful, as if he were afraid I might say something unexpected if it lasted too long. "I'm glad you came," he said. So was I. He looked different, straighter, more assured. The confidence of someone who believes the most difficult part is already behind him. He didn't ask about the house. He didn't ask about the money. He didn't ask how I was doing. He believed those questions were no longer necessary. When he stepped away to greet someone else, I finally saw her properly. His bride stood near the center of the room, radiant and composed, accepting congratulations as if they were confirmations of something she already knew. When our eyes met, her smile widened, just slightly professional and practiced. She approached me with a grace that suggested she'd rehearsed the moment. "I'm so glad you could make it," she said, taking my hands briefly. "It means a lot to him." Her grip was light, her eyes were not. I told her it was a beautiful ceremony. She thanked me and asked casually where I was staying these days. The question slid into the conversation like it belonged there. I answered vaguely. She nodded, satisfied enough for now, and moved on to the next guest. I watched the room as the ceremony began. Who sat closest to the couple? Who was deferred to? Who was tolerated? Power has a rhythm when you know how to listen for it. My son moved confidently through it, greeting people with easy familiarity. He enjoyed being watched. During the vows, I stood near the back. His words were polished, emotional, in the right places, spoken by someone who knew how to sound sincere. When he promised commitment and loyalty, a few people wiped their eyes. I did not. When the applause came, it was thunderous. He kissed his bride and raised their joined hands, triumphant. Cameras flashed, music swelled. The story they wanted the room to see was complete. At the reception, the tests began. A friend of his approached me with a smile that carried too much curiosity. "You must be proud," he said. "He's really made something of himself." I smiled back. He certainly believes so. Later, during the toasts, my son mentioned me by name. He thanked me for everything I'd done for him, for teaching him responsibility, for preparing him for life. The room applauded again warmly this time. He looked at me as he raised his glass, watching carefully for my reaction. I lifted my glass in return. That was all he needed. After dinner, he found me near the terrace doors. The music was louder now, conversation easier. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Everything okay?" he asked. I met his eyes. "Everything's fine." He studied my face for a moment, as if searching for cracks. Finding none, he smiled and clapped me on the shoulder. "Good," he said. "I knew you'd understand." Understand. The word hung between us, loaded with assumptions. He believed my presence confirmed his version of events. That my silence meant surrender. That whatever doubts he'd carried were unnecessary. We were interrupted by his wife, who slipped her arm through his. She looked at me with polite certainty. "We'll talk more soon," she said. "There are a few things we'll need to sort out. Need, not want." not discuss. Need. I nodded. As the night wore on, the contrast sharpened. Joy around me. Calculation within me. I watched them dance, laugh, toast their future. I watched how they moved together, how decisions were made without consultation, how authority shifted seamlessly between them. This was not a partnership built on hesitation. At one point, I stepped outside for air. The night was cool, the city lights distant. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't need to check it to know what it was. Still, I did. A single message. Brief. Confirmed. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked up at the sky. Preparations were complete. The structure I'd set in motion had reached the stage where it no longer required my input. From here on, it would move according to its own rules. Inside, the music swelled again. Someone called for another toast. Laughter followed. My son was enjoying himself fully now, his earlier vigilance replaced by comfort. He had done what he came to do. He believed the story was finished. I let him have the night. There would be no scenes, no confrontations, no dramatic revelations. Tonight was for celebration, for memory, for the image he would carry forward with him. Someday, when this night returned to him uninvited, it would feel different. As I said my goodbyes, people thanked me for coming, for supporting them, for being gracious. I accepted their words and returned them with care. Outside, the car waited, engine running. As I pulled away, the venue shrinking behind me, I felt no urge to look back. The performance had been convincing, the audience satisfied, the actors confident in their roles. What they didn't know was that performances end the moment the lights go out. And soon the silence would begin to ask questions they were not prepared to answer. The silence after the wedding was louder than the music had been. When the calls stopped and the congratulations faded, what remained was expectation. Not mine, theirs. It began the very next morning. A short message from my son, stripped of ceremony and warmth. He thanked me again for coming, then moved directly to logistics. He spoke about timing, about what would happen next, about arrangements that needed to be made. There was no question mark anywhere in the message. I read it twice and set the phone down without responding. Later that day, his wife called. Her tone was pleasant, efficient, and carefully calm. She spoke as if we were already aligned, as if agreement had been reached and only details remained. She used words like easier, practical, and best for everyone. She never asked what I wanted. She explained that they were concerned about me being alone, that it might be time to consider alternatives. She framed it as care, but the shape of it was unmistakable. Decisions were being presented as conclusions. My role in the conversation had been reduced to acknowledgement. I told her I would think about it. She paused just long enough to register that wasn't the answer she expected. Then she thanked me and ended the call. From that moment on, the shift was complete. My son stopped pretending this was about help. His messages grew firmer. He spoke less like a concerned child and more like a manager overseeing a delayed transition. He referenced plans they had already discussed with others. He spoke about my future as if it were a shared project I had neglected to attend meetings for. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. Power, when assumed, doesn't shout. When I did respond, my replies were brief and neutral. I didn't argue. I didn't resist openly. I acknowledged receipt. I asked for clarification where necessary. Each response gave them just enough to continue believing I was compliant. They mistook calm for surrender. A few days later, they invited me to dinner, not out of affection, but to formalize what they believed was already decided. The invitation was framed as an opportunity to talk things through, but the tone suggested the talking had already been done. I accepted. Their new home was impressive in a way meant to be noticed. Clean lines, open spaces, everything curated. When I arrived, they greeted me with rehearsed warmth. The table was set neatly, portions measured, conversation polite. We ate before anyone mentioned the real reason I was there. Eventually, his wife cleared her throat and leaned forward slightly, hands folded. We've been thinking a lot about what's best moving forward, she said. Especially now that things have changed. Changed? Another word doing too much work. She outlined a plan. Where I might stay, how things could be structured, what support would look like. She spoke with confidence, as if reading from notes she'd already memorized. My son nodded along, occasionally adding details. They finished each other's sentences. The unity was deliberate. A shared front. When they were done, they looked at me expectantly. I took a sip of water and said nothing. The silence stretched. My son shifted in his chair. His wife maintained her smile, though it tightened at the edges. This would really simplify things, she added. It would avoid unnecessary complications. There it was, the shift from persuasion to pressure. I met her eyes. Complications for whom? She blinked, caught off guard by the question. For everyone, she said quickly. I nodded. I see. That was all. The change in the room was subtle, but immediate. My son's posture stiffened. He glanced at his wife, then back at me. They had expected either agreement or resistance. Neutrality unsettled them. Later that evening, as we stood near the door, my son spoke more directly. You can't keep living like nothing's changed, he said. We're trying to help you. I looked at him carefully, at the confidence in his stance, at the certainty in his voice. You're trying to manage me, I said quietly. Those aren't the same thing. He laughed sharp and dismissive. You're being dramatic. That laugh did something final inside me. It stripped away the last trace of uncertainty. This was no longer misunderstanding. It was contempt wrapped in familiarity. After that, they stopped pretending altogether. The suggestions became instructions. The concern became impatience. They spoke openly about timelines, about next steps, about what they would do if I didn't cooperate. It was all framed as inevitability, not coercion. At one point, his wife said, "We don't want this to get difficult." I answered, "Neither do I." She smiled, satisfied, believing she had secured my compliance. She didn't hear the difference between difficulty and accountability. They began making plans without consulting me, booking things, informing me after the fact. They spoke about me in the third person while I was in the room. Each small dismissal carried more weight than any open insult could have. That was when hope finally dissolved. Not hope that they would change, but hope that this could be resolved without consequence. The line had been crossed so completely that there was no longer anything to salvage. Strangely, that realization brought relief. When you stop hoping for a different version of people, you start seeing them clearly. And once seen clearly, they become predictable. They assumed I was isolated, that I had nowhere to go, that I lacked leverage. They spoke as though time were on their side, as though patience belonged only to them. I let them believe it. Every conversation, every message, every plan they shared confirmed what I already knew. Overconfidence makes people careless. Carelessness creates openings. One afternoon, my son mentioned something casually that he hadn't meant to. A timeline, a dependency, a step they were counting on that hadn't yet happened. He didn't realize he'd said too much. I noted it and said nothing. That evening, I sat alone in the quiet of my temporary room and reflected on the path that had brought us here. Not with anger, with precision. This was no longer personal. It was procedural. They thought I was cornered. They thought my options had run out. They thought age had narrowed my world to whatever they allowed. They were wrong on every count. As night settled in, I checked my phone once more. No new messages, no demands, no instructions. For the first time since the wedding, the silence belonged to me. I set the phone aside and turned off the light, feeling no urgency, no anxiety. Everything was moving exactly as it should. They had shown me who they were when they believed they were untouchable. And that, more than anything else, had sealed what would happen next. Every long game reaches a point where silence stops being passive and starts doing work. For me, that point arrived quietly, without ceremony, on an afternoon when nothing seemed urgent and everything finally made sense. Years earlier, long before my son ever thought to ask questions about my finances, I had made a decision that felt almost boring at the time. It wasn't driven by fear or mistrust. It was driven by experience. I had seen too many lives unravel because everything depended on a single visible structure, one account, one property, one obvious chain of control. So I separated things, not dramatically, not secretly, methodically. I created layers, responsibilities that didn't overlap, assets that didn't announce themselves, authority that required more than a signature and a sense of entitlement. It was protection, not paranoia, independence, not deception. At the time, there was no reason to explain it to anyone, least of all, my son. Trust doesn't require full disclosure, and privacy is not the same thing as secrecy. I didn't owe anyone a map of my safeguards. That choice sat quietly in the background of my life for years, irrelevant to daily routines, invisible to casual observers. It didn't matter while trust remained intact. Now, it mattered. I decided to let a single thread surface, just enough to be noticed, not enough to be understood. It happened indirectly. A document referenced by someone who shouldn't have known it existed. A procedural question that reached my son from the side, not from me. I didn't push it forward. I simply stopped holding it back. The effect was immediate. My son called that evening, his voice steady but strained. He didn't ask questions directly. He spoke in statements that ended just shy of interrogation. "There seems to be some confusion," he said, "about how things were set up." I listened. He explained what he believed was happening. His version was neat, contained wrong. He assumed the issue was technical, an oversight, something that could be resolved with the right explanation. I let him finish. "I'm not confused," I said, "but I understand why you are." There was a pause. Not long, but telling. He recovered quickly, laughed it off, said it was probably nothing, that everything was under control. But certainty doesn't need reassurance. Fear does. When his wife reached out the next day, the tone was different, less polished, more urgent. She asked directly what I knew, what I intended to do, whether there was something they should be aware of. I answered her questions with the same restraint I'd used all along. I gave her truth without context, facts without explanation, enough to unsettle, not enough to anchor. She pressed. I didn't. From that moment on, the dynamic shifted. They were no longer planning ahead. They were reacting. Their conversations grew shorter, more careful. Their confidence developed edges. I watched the ripple spread. Others began asking questions too. Not accusing questions, clarifying ones. The kind that appear when assumptions start to wobble. People who had been comfortable in their understanding suddenly wanted verification. Confirmation, context. Power relies on shared belief. Once belief fractures, everything built on it begins to tremble. Through all of this, I remained calm. Not because I enjoyed the tension, but because calm was the natural result of clarity. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't hoping. I knew exactly where things stood. My son tried to regain control by narrowing the conversation. He focused on what he thought was the problem, convinced he had identified the full scope of it. He proposed solutions, adjustments, compromises. All of them were based on incomplete information. He believed he was fixing a leak. He didn't realize he was standing in a different building entirely. The wife, sharper than he was, sensed this sooner. I could hear it in the way her voice tightened, the way she pushed for definitive answers. She wanted certainty restored, even if it meant confrontation. That was when I knew the timing was right. I didn't reveal anything new. I didn't escalate. I simply stopped softening my responses. I let my words stand as they were, unadorned and uncorrected. They reached their own conclusions quickly. Incorrect ones. They decided the issue was contained, that they understood the risk, that whatever leverage existed could be managed if they moved carefully. They adjusted their plans accordingly. That decision told me everything I needed to know. When people believe they have found the edge of a problem, they stop looking beyond it. They grow bold again, confident, predictable. For the first time since this began, they were responding to me instead of the other way around. Every message they sent revealed urgency. Every delay on my part magnified it. I watched without interference as they tried to regain footing. As they spoke to the wrong people, asked the wrong questions, reached for reassurances that were no longer available. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even the climax. It was the shift. The board had moved. The pieces were no longer where they believed them to be. And for the first time, they were aware of it. I sat alone that evening, the room quiet, my phone resting face down on the table. I felt no excitement, no triumph, just the steady awareness that the path forward was now unavoidable. They had stepped into something they didn't understand, and soon understanding would be forced upon them, whether they wanted it or not. They asked to meet 2 days later. Not invited, asked. The message was careful, polished, and urgent in a way they tried to disguise. It framed the conversation as necessary, overdue, and mutually beneficial. The kind of language people use when they believe they are still in control but can feel it slipping. I agreed without hesitation. They chose the place. A private office downtown, all glass and steel, designed to feel authoritative. Neutral ground, my son called it. He said it like a concession, as if granting me dignity by not meeting in his home. I arrived early and took a seat facing the window where I could watch the street below and let the room reveal its intentions. They arrived together. My son entered first, shoulders squared, expression set. His wife followed closely, already scanning the room, measuring. They sat across from me, aligned knees, angled slightly toward one another. A united front. They believed that was still an advantage. "Thanks for coming," my son said. I nodded. He began by explaining the situation as he saw it. Calm, reasonable. He spoke about misunderstandings and miscommunications, about how things had escalated unnecessarily, about how everyone wanted the same outcome even if the path there had become complicated. He never once said the word wrong. When he finished, his wife took over seamlessly. She reframed his points with more precision, smoothing edges, positioning herself as the voice of balance. She talked about efficiency, about avoiding unnecessary exposure, about resolving matters quietly. "You have to understand," she said, leaning forward slightly. "We're trying to protect you." Protect. Another word doing too much work. They laid out their solution next. Options, they called them. A few variations of the same outcome presented with subtle differences meant to give the illusion of choice. Compliance wrapped in courtesy. Each option assumed my agreement. Each one benefited them. I listened without interrupting hands, folded expression neutral. When they were done, they looked at me expectantly, the way people do when they believe the hardest part is over. "What do you think?" my son asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked a question, a simple one, clarifying, not confrontational. It focused on a detail they had overlooked, something they assumed was settled, but wasn't. I watched as they exchanged a glance before responding. "That's already been handled," my son said quickly. "By whom?" I asked. Another pause, shorter this time. His wife answered instead, supplying a name, a role, a justification. She spoke confidently, but her voice carried the faintest tremor. "Not fear. Calculation." I nodded. "And the documentation?" They shifted again. The temperature in the room changed. Not dramatically, just enough to register. My son leaned back, crossing his arms, a gesture meant to reassert authority. His wife's smile tightened. "You're focusing on the wrong things," she said. "We're trying to move forward." "Forward," I repeated. "From where?" That was when the first crack appeared. My son corrected himself mid-sentence. A small thing. A word changed at the last moment. He glanced at his wife, then back at me. It was nothing most people would notice. I noticed. They moved to pressure next, subtle at first. References to time, to costs, to what would happen if this dragged on. They framed resistance as inconvenience, delay as irresponsibility. I let them speak. Then I offered a single fact, one they couldn't argue with. I didn't explain it. I didn't contextualize it. I simply stated it and waited. The effect was immediate. My son went still. His wife blinked once, then again, processing. The confidence they had walked in with evaporated in stages. Not collapse. Recalculation. That doesn't change anything, my son said finally. It changes everything, his wife said at the same time. They looked at each other, startled. From that point on, the conversation fractured. My son tried to regain control through force of tone, raising his voice just enough to signal impatience. His wife tried a different approach, appealing to reason, to family, to what she called common sense. I answered neither with agreement nor refusal. I asked another question, then another. Each one exposed an assumption. Each one forced them to explain something they believed didn't require explanation. Desperation crept in around the edges. They began to speak faster, overlapping, interrupting one another. My son invoked loyalty, blood, everything I'd done for him. His wife invoked pragmatism, the idea that fighting would only make things worse. I don't want to do this the hard way, my son said. I looked at him steadily. Then you shouldn't have done it this way. Silence fell heavy and unfamiliar. They had expected anger, or pleading, or capitulation. What they got instead was certainty. Not loud, not theatrical, absolute. My son tried one last angle. He leaned forward, voice low, conspiratorial. You don't have the leverage you think you do, he said. We've covered this. I didn't correct him. That was the moment I knew the meeting was over. There is a point in every confrontation when more words stop adding clarity and start creating risk. We had passed it. I stood slowly, deliberately gathering my coat without hurry. I'll be in touch, I said, with whom his wife asked sharply. I met her eyes. The appropriate parties. They stood as well, their movements less coordinated now. My son opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. He looked smaller in that moment, not physically, structurally. As I walked out of the office, I felt nothing dramatic. No surge of victory, no regret, just confirmation. The conversation hadn't been about compromise. It had been about control, and control had already changed hands. Outside, the air was crisp, the city moving on around me, without concern. I paused on the sidewalk, adjusting my coat, and allowed myself a single breath of reflection. They believed they had confronted me. In reality, they had confirmed my timing. The trap was no longer theoretical. It was closing whether they chose to acknowledge it or not. Once a decision is made, the rest is procedure. Emotion becomes irrelevant. Timing takes over. The first call didn't come from my son. It came from someone he didn't expect to hear from so soon. I wasn't on the line when it happened, but I didn't need to be. Systems move with a momentum of their own, once activated, and this one had been waiting patiently for the right signal. By midday, my phone began to vibrate with messages that carried a different tone than before. Shorter, sharper. Questions that tried to sound casual but failed. My son asked if I had heard anything unusual. He asked if I knew why certain requests had been made. He asked if I had spoken to anyone recently. I replied hours later with a single sentence. I'm aware. That was enough. The next message came from his wife. Gone was the careful polish. Gone were the measured words. She asked directly what I had done, what I was trying to accomplish, who I was working with. I didn't answer. By the following morning, the situation had escalated beyond their ability to manage it internally. Institutions don't argue. They notify, they document, they proceed. My son was no longer the one making calls. He was receiving them. When he showed up at my door that afternoon, I almost didn't recognize him. The confidence he'd worn so comfortably for weeks was gone. His posture was tense, movements, clipped eyes darting as if searching for exits that didn't exist. He didn't wait to be invited inside. "We need to talk," he said. I stepped aside and let him in. He paced the living room while I remained standing, hands loosely at my sides. He spoke quickly, explanations tumbling over one another, blaming misunderstandings, third parties' timing. He insisted nothing had been intentional, that everything could still be fixed. I listened. When he finished, I asked him to sit down. He hesitated, then did. The shift from pacing to stillness unsettled him more than I expected. "You've been contacted," I said. He nodded. "That doesn't mean anything. People ask questions all the time." "They don't ask those questions," I replied. "Not unless there's a reason." He swallowed. His wife arrived shortly after, breathless and composed only by effort. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She went straight to the point, placing documents on the table as if they might shield her. "We need to resolve this quietly," she said, "before it gets worse." "Worse for whom?" I asked. She didn't answer. They tried then to do what people always do when control slips away. They shifted blame. My son suggested he'd been advised poorly, that he'd trusted the wrong people, that none of this would have happened if circumstances had been clearer. His wife tried a different tactic. She spoke about stress, about pressure, about how difficult the transition had been. She suggested I had misunderstood their intentions, that everything they'd done had been for my benefit. I let her finish. Then I placed a single document on the table between us. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was clean, precise, and final, in a way no argument could undo. The kind of paper that doesn't invite discussion, only acknowledgement. They stared at it. My son picked it up first, scanning quickly, then more slowly, as comprehension caught up with him. His face drained of color. His wife leaned over his shoulder, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "This isn't," she began. "It is," I said. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. That was the moment they stopped arguing and started appealing. My son looked at me, then really looked at me, as if trying to reconcile the man sitting across from him with the assumptions he'd been living by. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Dad," he said, "please, we can figure something out." It was the first time in weeks he'd called me that. I felt the weight of it, but I didn't move. I didn't soften. Compassion does not require surrender. "What you're asking for now," I said, "is not help. It's mercy." His wife stiffened. "This will destroy everything," she said. "Careers, reputations, our future." I met her gaze evenly. "You should have considered that before deciding my life was yours to manage." The room felt smaller then, the air heavier. They argued briefly between themselves, voices low and sharp, blame flickering back and forth like a match being struck and extinguished. Unity collapsed quickly under pressure. It always does. I waited. When they turned back to me, there was nothing left to negotiate. The process had already crossed the threshold where intervention mattered. Calls had been made, records reviewed, timelines established. "There's nothing more I can do," I said, "and nothing more I will do." My son stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. He looked lost, smaller than I had ever seen him. For a moment I wondered if he might finally understand what he had done. Then his jaw tightened. "This didn't have to happen," he said. "No," I agreed. "It didn't." That was the last thing I said to him that day. After they left, the house returned to silence. Not the empty kind, but the settled kind. The kind that follows resolution. Over the next few days, confirmations arrived one by one. Official, irreversible. The system did what it was designed to do. There were no dramatic scenes, no public spectacle, just consequences unfolding methodically. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a steady sense of finality. One evening, as I sat alone, I allowed myself to acknowledge the cost. I had lost my son long before this. What I lost now was the illusion that I could protect him from his own choices. That illusion had been expensive. But clarity once gained brings a different kind of peace. When the last confirmation came through, I read it once and set it aside. There was nothing more to consider. The story had shifted permanently whether anyone involved liked it or not. Justice, I learned, doesn't announce itself with noise. It arrives quietly. And when it does, the only thing left to hear is the sound of doors closing behind you. The first morning after everything settled was quieter than I expected. No phone calls. No messages asking for explanations or forgiveness, just light coming through the window and the sound of my own breathing steady and unhurried. For the first time in weeks, nothing was demanding my attention. I made my coffee the way I always had, standing at the counter, watching steam rise from the cup. The routine felt grounding, familiar. It reminded me that despite everything that had happened, the world hadn't collapsed. My life hadn't ended. It had simply shed something heavy. Peace doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives like this, unnoticed at first, until you realize you're no longer bracing yourself. There were things I didn't get back. I didn't get my son back, not the version of him I once knew. I didn't get an apology that meant anything or an explanation that made sense. Some losses don't come with closure. They come with acceptance instead. I let myself acknowledge that without dressing it up. There is grief in losing a child who's still alive, especially when the loss is not physical, but moral. I had to accept that the boy I raised no longer existed in the way I remembered him. That truth hurt, but pretending otherwise would have hurt more. What I refused to lose was myself. I kept my dignity. I kept my clarity. I kept the right to decide what happened to my life, my time, and my future. Those things matter more than any account balance ever could. Money can be replaced. Self-respect once surrendered is far harder to reclaim. As the days passed, I found myself thinking differently about family. For most of my life, I believed blood was an obligation you honored no matter the cost. That belief kept me silent longer than I should have been. It taught me to endure things that should have been confronted. Family, I learned, is not defined by who shares your name. It's defined by who respects your boundaries, who listens when you speak, who doesn't see your age or your kindness as an opportunity. Legacy isn't what you leave behind in a document. It's what you refuse to tolerate while you're still here. I thought often about silence, how I had used it poorly in the past, mistaking it for patience and grace. Silence without awareness is vulnerability. Silence with clarity is power. The difference between the two is the difference between being managed and being free. I wish I had understood that sooner. But understanding it now was enough. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, know this. Age does not make you weak. Experience does not disqualify you from control. And kindness is not a contract that others are allowed to exploit. There is a moment when you have to choose between preserving a relationship at any cost and preserving yourself. That choice is rarely clean. It rarely feels good. But it is often necessary. This story isn't about winning. It isn't about humiliation or revenge in the way people like to imagine it. It's about reclaiming authorship of your own life after someone else decided to write the ending for you. The irony is that once I stopped fighting to be understood, everything became clear. I didn't need to convince anyone of my worth. I only needed to act in accordance with it. I still think about my son sometimes. Not with anger, but with a kind of distant sadness. I hope someday he understands what he lost. Not financially, but relationally. If he doesn't, that is something he will have to live with, not me. What I live with now is quieter, lighter, more honest. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose dignity over family? Have you ever been pushed into silence until you realized silence was costing you more than speaking up? Share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this don't end when the video ends. They continue in conversation. And if you want to hear more real stories about justice, boundaries, and reclaiming self-respect later in life, stay here. Subscribe to the channel and take your time listening. You're not alone in this. Life doesn't end with betrayal. Sometimes that's exactly where it begins again.